If you're new to wildlife photography, then you'd know that you have to be extremely quick in dialing in the perfect settings to get your shot. In this video, I'll go through my personal recommendations for camera settings in wildlife photography. I will go into this video with the assumption that you already know the basic knowledge of the exposure triangle, namely shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. If not, there are plenty of YouTube videos out there that can explain these. The first question we will tackle is, what mode should I use? The thing to know about wildlife photography is that you got to be in control of most of your settings to get your desired results. P mode is basically automatic, letting the camera decide for you, and thus I would avoid it at all costs. S mode lets you control the shutter speed, while the aperture is being decided by the camera. Again, since aperture controls depth of field, we don't want the camera to decide that for us. A mode is a mode that some wildlife photographers like using. In this mode, you control the aperture and the camera decides your shutter speed. Again, I do not recommend this mode since there are times when specific subjects and behavior call for certain shutter speeds. The only mode left that I advocate for is M, or manual mode. But people tell me there are 3 different settings to control in manual mode, and that takes time. By the time I dial in the right settings, the animal has disappeared. What should I do? To get our settings right beforehand, we have to understand the environment that we are in. I'm going to break this down by scenarios, but for the sake of this video, we are excluding any underwater photography, night photography, or flash photography. Here are some things that we need to note. Is the sun out, or is it a cloudy or rainy day? Am I shooting in shade, for instance, under the cover of trees or out in the open? What is the direction of the sun? Am I shooting into the sun? The next thing that we have to take note of is the subject that we want to photograph. It's always good to know prior what kind of subjects you expect to photograph. Here are some guiding questions for your subject. Is my subject fast or slow moving? For instance, am I aiming to get a bird in flight or a stationary animal? Am I aiming to get a close-up portrait of a small animal, an isolated full body shot, or a group shot? What color is my subject? Take note if its color is black or white. These days, cameras are getting better at handling high ISOs. Various post-processing softwares like Lightroom and Topaz have their own versions of denoising, doing an incredible job of getting clean images that have ridiculously high ISOs. So, don't be too worried that your ISO goes too high. After all, remember that you can save a noisy image, but not a blurry one. Now that you have briefly understood the various things that should go through your head, let's talk settings proper. Before I go out in the field, I like to have my default settings locked in case I see something and need to quickly get a shot. So, my default mode is M mode, being able to manually change the aperture and shutter speed, but using auto ISO. Here are the default settings I have in my camera before I even go out into the field. By default, I always start with the widest aperture that my lens can do. For instance, if my lens is an f5.6 lens, then that will be the default aperture I will be at. The reason being, in many instances in wildlife photography, you'll want as much light as possible to enter the lens. You can always change the aperture later on based on the subject that you are shooting. My exposure compensation will be at -0.3 to darken the images slightly, so as to preserve highlight information if necessary. You can then change the exposure compensation later on based on the environment or the subject that you are shooting. It's hard to say what a good default shutter speed your camera should be at, but I generally place mine around 1/250 to 1/800 of a second. I know people say that your shutter speed should be double your focal length, meaning that if your lens is 400mm, you should be at least at 1/800 of a second. But for me, that's irrelevant these days if you have cameras and lenses with built-in stabilization. I've shot some pictures handheld at 1/15 of a second and it turned out fine. Now that your camera is dialed in, let's head out to the field. Here are some common scenarios that I've come up with that gives you a rough guide of the settings that you should be using. This is the ideal scenario for wildlife photography. A nice bright day with little to no cloud cover and your subject is out in the open. Maybe it's a bird on the lake or some animal on an open field. You have more than sufficient light. If you have more than one subject that you need to photograph in the same frame, feel free to close down the aperture. If you are looking to photograph action, like birds in flight, feel free to bump up that shutter speed. Your images will be clean because your ISO will never be that high. Nothing to worry about. Let's say the sun is low on the horizon. Maybe it's the early morning or late afternoon. Your subject is backlit or against the sun. Choose your shutter speed and aperture based on your subject. Now here's the beauty of Auto ISO. It takes the guesswork out of what ISO you should be using. If you want a silhouette shot, dial down the exposure compensation by -1 and adjust if necessary. If you want to see the subject well and don't mind the background being possibly blown, dial up the exposure compensation by +1 and adjust if necessary. When it comes to black or white animals, the exposure compensation gets a little bit trickier. For a black animal, you'll need to dial up the exposure compensation. This results in the background possibly being brighter than your subject. If it's against the sky, then most likely the sky will be blown. For a white animal, you'll need to dial down the exposure compensation. This results in your background being darker and quite likely going almost black. This can be an interesting aesthetic look for some of your photographs. Now when the lighting gets darker, this is when you have to find a good balance. I always start by prioritizing shutter speed. If you need to capture action shots, then there's no question that you'll need to bump up that shutter speed. Then I consider aperture. Generally, I try to leave it as wide open as possible, unless in specific scenarios like trying to get a group shot or being really close to a small subject like a bird. The same exposure compensation rules apply as before. You'll notice that your final ISO will be a lot higher, but you can apply noise reduction in your editing software. Of course, if your ISO gets ridiculously high, such as anything above 12,800, it could be time to try bringing down the shutter speed to a level where you can still get sharp shots and maintain a lower ISO. So this is the way I approach dialing in my settings for wildlife photography. Of course, everyone has their own way of doing it, and what works for me may not work for you, but I do find that this is the quickest and easiest method while maintaining a high level of control over your settings.